could be important, and maybe it isn't important. It could be important for 5 years, and then 5 years later another group of scholars comes along. I mean, there's new scholars every 5-10 years. And they have to make their name. So, for instance, what someone said in 1940, does anyone ever read what a scholar said in 1940? Rarely. I mean, occasionally there's a great scholar that everyone refers back to, okay, it's sort of like almost a primary source. But normally speaking, scholars, there are waves of scholarship. And each new wave sort of revises or changes or moves along from the previous wave. And in this subject, it's an endless process. Plus, the literature in this subject is vast. I mean, there's such a vast literature that you could spend your whole life. I'm talking about secondary literature. You could spend your whole life investigating. And to my mind, maybe sometimes never get to the end, and the law of diminishing returns, which is what happens to some people in graduate school. Do you know the difference between primary and secondary literature? What would be an example of a primary literature, and what would a secondary literature be, just so we get these terms more familiar to you? And this field has, the historical Jesus field has a huge secondary literature. Maybe even, I don't even know what third is. Third is tertiary, is it? I thought that's fourth, tertiary. I'm not sure if tertiary is third or fourth. I think it's fourth. I don't even know what thirdary is. Is tertiary third or fourth?
Third.
Third? Oh, good. Tertiary, so they probably have to use, is there a fourthiary? Quadrary? Quadrary? I don't know. Some of this is tertiary literature, I think. What's primary literature and secondary literature? Who can tell? Sources, literature.
Would primary literature be like Josephus?
Yeah, exactly. Primary literature is first sources, normally eyewitness sources. That's why you could have a tertiary literature here, because you could say secondary literature is church fathers, you know, who are much after the event and are already talking about these things as if it's, you know, something they're looking at themselves. Eusebius, for instance, is culling his sources. So, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily, you know, be restricted just to levels of sources, primary and secondary. But normally we bunch the church fathers under primary sources. Yeah.
I would consider Paul primary.
Oh, absolutely.
However, when he talks about Jesus, it's secondary, isn't it? Because he's never met him.
No. I mean, a primary source is not whether he met Jesus, because there's no primary sources for Jesus, because no one ever met him, and there was no tape recorder. So, I mean, that's, I think, besides the point. We can't speak of a primary source for Apollo or Osiris or one of these, you know, formidable but largely storied people of the ancient past. Most, even Socrates, we don't have a primary source for Socrates, because nothing Socrates ever said he wrote himself, but Plato wrote down what he said Socrates said, so that's a primary source. So Paul is writing down what he thinks Jesus said. So you're talking about chronologically Paul as secondary. Okay, that could be, but I think Paul's definitely primary source. No doubt of that. I don't know. Just,
well, these
are artificial distinctions anyway. But go ahead. Go ahead. What's your
I'd like to go back.
Wait. I didn't finish his point. What was the point you wanted to finish up?
I stopped.
Okay, yeah.
I'd like to go back to Eusebius for a minute. Do you see him, since he really wrote 400 years later,
300 years later,
a history of the church by culling sources, as you say.
And also inserting his own opinion here and there.
So he's not a tertiary?
Oh, well, a secondary? Well, yeah, theoretically he's a secondary source, but I'm saying we have, secondary sources are like scholars today, you know, that's what we normally call secondary. That's what I was getting at. I mean, there's a vast literature. You're going to call that tertiary literature? I mean, that we're getting really splitting hairs here. Usually we just call that all secondary literature, and so therefore you got to bump the church fathers up to a primary source. You know, I think, you know, rabbinic literature, primary source, even though it doesn't talk about the these things necessarily directly, but indirectly there's echoes of these things. Josephus certainly primary. Gospels primary, even though the Gospels most people would consider secondary, in the sense that they were written at a later date by secondary people. But in fact, that's why Paul, most people would put primary, and it's hard for people to understand that. The reason is because in most reasonable, and I say reasonable in quotes, one person, woman, man's reason is another man's insanity or poison. Look at what happened to the Pope the other day. I mean, I think the Pope actually made a very reasonable statement, even though he was provocative and purposefully so. I'm sure he was doing it on purpose. And it's about time someone stood up and say, "Hey, boys, if you're going to, if you're going to always want tolerance from everybody else, when are you going to show a little tolerance? And let's stop this one-sided game that's going on. You know, you think you can just go around lopping people's heads off and, burning down this, burning down that, and then want us all to tolerate you, where you don't tolerate anybody, and you can make cartoons and say whatever you want." So the Pope politely was, giving them a jab in that area. And frankly, I think he was very brave to do that. And I take my hat off to him, honestly. One of the few, I'm sure, who understands that he did it purposefully and bravely. And he did it with malice aforethought. He knew what he was doing. He's not a stupid person. He's a very intellectual man. He studies his sources, and he crafted it extremely well. I'm off subject, but as long as we're on it, it's the best question. I'm off the subject, but he did it by quoting a Byzantine emperor of the 14th century. So therefore, if someone came back on him, he could say, well, that's not my view. It's just this Byzantine emperor. And in addition, it wasn't a Catholic source. It was a Greek Orthodox source. So he's doubly removed from it. He just said, here's what a Byzantine emperor of 14th century said. He said, this religion is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go to the negatives. But finally it said it believes that it can impose its will by violence. And then he picked up that theme and said, I don't think that interreligious discourse is helped by violence. And then of course the reaction was totally violent, which basically proved his point. But I think people in the modern world don't get what the situation really is. You're dealing with groups of people who have not separated church and state, as we think in the Western modern world it should be separated. So you're having a dialogue between groups of people who do not have their basic freedoms protected by separation of church and state, who are not permitted to say anything. People, for instance, say in the Middle Eastern world, I don't want to